Now that we've looked at the out-of-the-box site templates and the sites they create, let's dive a little bit deeper into what makes up those sites, and that's the lists and libraries. And we're going to look at the out-of-the-box templates that you'll be able to work with here and kind of go over what's there so you'll be familiar with that. Later on, we'll look at modifying these, and I'll kind of touch on that a little bit as we look at it in the SharePoint site. But first, let me kind of talk through what you're going to be seeing, some of the concepts behind it, and some of the things to be thinking about as we walk through the different lists and libraries. The first is, what is the difference between a list and a library? And on the surface, or for your users, they're going to see a pretty good bit of difference. There's a lot of user experience differences between the two, but underneath the hood, they're pretty much the same thing. What happens is SharePoint takes your data and it stores it in a SQL database table. That table is pretty much the same between the lists and libraries. You have the same capabilities between the two. Things like metadata and being able to do versioning and be able to do attachments and all of those kind of things. But libraries make it a little bit easier to work with these lists in a way that's a little bit more familiar, especially for users that are used to working with things like file shares and network shares. So things like a document library where they can just drag and drop a file into the library, and it'll get some default metadata. They may need to add some additional information associated with that. They can actually drag files out of that and be able to work with it in a little bit more familiar manner. Whereas lists are most commonly used as either in a Excel spreadsheet type format where you can actually see all that data in the list, or maybe you actually do a little customization on it and actually just looks like a read-only list that may be a web page. So there's some things in here that you'll need to be thinking of when you're looking at your users visiting your site. But know that underneath the hood, these are very similar for management. What we're going to look at is the standard libraries, kind of getting started there first, and what are some things to be aware of as you go through that. The first one we're going to look at is actually one of the libraries that's almost always used in SharePoint. And sometimes there are organizations that actually deploy SharePoint just to get the document library. And this is quite literally something that's built to look just like a network file share. It's something that you can actually do a WebDAV connection and drag and drop off of your desktop to a folder on your machine. You can actually work with it through the web page by automatic uploads and batch uploads and things like that. The document libraries themselves can be viewed as a library on your machine. If you're running Windows Vista Forward that has libraries, you can actually have files that would normally appear to be saved on the local drive actually saved into SharePoint by default. So there's a lot of valuable usage here, and your users can get a lot of capabilities. The thing to be aware of with document libraries are if you're using versioning, everything that goes into a document library is a copy for each version. There's no kind of differentials between those. So if you've got a 100 meg PowerPoint file that you're putting into a document library and you're keeping 5 versions back, if you're using all of those versions, that's 500 megabytes on your server. So the document library is probably one of the biggest things to look at for managing your content on a SharePoint site, especially if you're allowing users to do things like upload video or audio. Things get fairly big fairly quickly, and if you're doing versioning on that, just be aware of that. One of the things you'll notice in document libraries is there's the concept of folders. This topic actually is just a little bit controversial because document libraries are kind of built to look like file systems, even though underneath they're not. A lot of people like to put in folders to be able to help organize their files. They may want to organize them by content type, maybe either a PowerPoint or Word, or maybe this is a document of type X or Y. The problem with that is that these folders are purely theoretical concepts. There's no real folder underneath it. They're actually just, you're creating a view that filters out things that don't match the metadata, which is the folder. I tend to recommend not using folders. They're too easy to kind of break the concept of when people put in custom views. They're very easy just to disappear, especially when you're looking at things like RSS feeds or synchronizing with your client applications. They're there. You can use them. I recommend that if you've got something that you actually think that you need a folder with, that you actually break it apart and actually have a separate document library. This has a couple of different benefits. One is that you actually have some real separation between those. They're all going kind of in the same place inside of SharePoint, but through the interface, through the SharePoint APIs, there's actually a pretty strong difference. The other piece is that if you're using folders, then you're possibly going to be looking at using different permissions on there. And it's a lot easier to manage that if you're doing that with a document library rather than doing it inside the document library. Things get very, very complex very quickly if you're actually putting different permissions inside the document library. You don't want to break the inheritance at any point if you can get away with it. But if you're actually keeping it at that library or list level, things can be a lot easier. There's a lot more tools to help you figure out what's going on with there. If you're looking at folders, think another library instead of actually dropping it in there and using that. If you do need to kind of do different views on that, do exactly that. Take a look at a view and filter on the content type or filter on some piece of metadata. And I think you'll find that a lot better for you than using the folders. Now, starting with those document libraries, let's look at some of the specialized libraries. These are libraries that have been kind of started off with those capabilities that a document library has, but can come in and give you that ability, like I said, with folders, of giving you a custom library for each of the different types of files that you want to do. For you as a manager, the asset library is very useful. This is a library that you can actually use for things such as logos, things that generally your users aren't going to be using that much, but you may want to give them access to working with it. Things may be such as, again, logos. Maybe you've got standard documents that they can use. Maybe it's snippets of HTML that you'd like to give them access to. All of these things go into an asset library. And the reason why that is because the asset library allows you to get proper scope on who can access that. An asset library is generally read-only except for managers, but you can actually let users see that, take that content, and be able to use it in everything from styling, maybe custom look and feel, maybe custom pieces that they want to put inside their site itself. So it's a good place to kind of drop that in there. Style sheets are another one that's really useful to be putting in an asset library for that custom look and feel, to be able to go, hey, I'd like this green, or I'd like it to look this way. This is where you put those in asset libraries. Then there are form libraries. Form libraries are the ability to actually have users have custom forms that they can come in, they can add information to, they can save that form. That form can be then associated with a workflow or something like that. Forms libraries are very, very valuable for things such as ticketing systems. If you've got a situation where maybe you have an IT request application or these kind of things, being able to have a forms library to come in, have someone do a self-service ad only, drop in, give you the information they need, and have that ticket being sent around to the organization to the appropriate place. I've actually seen this be used in ways that have meant that you haven't had to have many custom applications. It's the ability to just basically drop in, say, here's the information I need for a new ticket or a new report or whatever, and be able to just have a very simple workflow to pass that around and monitor what's going on with that. So forms libraries are very valuable. Note that forms libraries are also associated with InfoPath. And currently, the future of InfoPath is being depreciated. So if you've got some historical InfoPath working with forms libraries, that's great. It's something that's still supported right now. But if you're looking at putting a new form together, I would really recommend just doing the web form and not connecting in an InfoPath, because this technology is going to be changing pretty dramatically in the next version of SharePoint. There's already been a kind of a warning, but not a lot of details about what's coming next. So just be aware as you look through that. The Wiki Page Library is another of these specialized libraries that is very useful. If you're used to working with wikis as a media wiki or some of the other different distributions, you kind of know the concepts there, but you also know that it can be sometimes a little challenging to keep everything straight or actually know where everything's put together. With SharePoint, Wiki Pages are in a library itself, And those pages are accessible to you. You can actually see what metadata is on them, what content is in there. Actually being able to do things like break it off and do different languages in there, or actually seeing what's going on with the auto linking and actually put some manual linking in there, all of those kind of things. So if you're a wiki person or you actually like doing that, go ahead and take a look at the wiki page library. I think you'll be really pleased with what's in there. It's not exactly the same dialect as some of the other wikis, but once you get used to it, you'll actually see some of the choices they made and see that it's very, very easy to manage wikis in SharePoint and be able to use them and have your users be very happy with them. There's the picture library, and this is kind of a document library that's customized just for images. And what this does is it allows you to get thumbnails. It allows you to actually work with that. And again, having that library as a picture library means that you can actually connect it into the desktop. You can actually have people able to work with assets in that library. You can actually do versioning on those. There's a lot of different details on theirs. But just think of it as like you would your pictures folder on your Windows desktop. The picture library gives you that kind of functionality of slideshows and things like that. And then we have our report library. And if you're using SharePoint with reporting services, this can actually be a customized library to be able to drop in reports, to actually have them automatically generated in a location, to be able to get you a good web viewer on those, to actually be able to not have to pull it all down or do all that kind of stuff. You get a in-browser good experience. So very optimized for the reports. If you're not using reporting services, probably something to take a look at, because there's a lot of very good capability if you're needing some BI in delivering that inside of SharePoint. So the next thing we're going to look at are the standard lists themselves. There are different groupings in here that I'm going to kind of go through. Again, when we get to the SharePoint site itself and I drop these in and we create them, you'll kind of see some of the details. Communications is one of the primary pieces for the SharePoint lists. You'll actually see both the pushing out information and collaboration. So those both kind of get grouped together here. The announcements is the one thing that you see on almost all templates. This is basically what comes up at the beginning when you visit the site so you can understand what's going on. This is generally locked down just for the owners of the site or the managers of the site, so you can actually put information up there, but you can actually allow others to put comments on those announcements if you choose to. So there's kind of a different way of working with that. I normally don't recommend doing that if you need users to kind of give feedback on things. When we get down to the discussion boards, that's probably the better place to do, but just know there's some capabilities here to give you a little bit of threading. The links list is a list that's specifically built for that, to actually give you a place to store hyperlinks. So why would you need kind of a separate list for that? Well, there's a lot of metadata that you can put onto those links. You can actually customize the view, give people a lot of different ways to manage that, and be able to actually provide it as resources for other lists. It's a nice, easy place for you to come in, drop all your links that aren't automatically created, give people a list of places that they can go, and by using multiple links libraries, you can actually have your content separated out and have a grouping of your links that make a lot of sense for your users. And then there are promoted links. Promoted links have a little bit of an additional UI attached to them. When we created each of the sites off the site templates, you would notice that there were some getting started links across the top of it. That's a promoted links list. It needs some additional work for your part, putting an icon and some other items in there to really make it look nice. But it's a way to kind of let people get started with your site, to give them some things that maybe they're not just standard things they need for their work, but maybe tutorials, information, all those kind of things, something that really needs to pop out. So this is a new list, so if you're not used to seeing this, it's a new SharePoint 2013 thing. Then there's contacts. This is from not used a huge amount, but it's really nice to be able to have maybe a list of all the people in your site, on your team, who needs to be notified for different things. I think that the contacts list is pretty underutilized for what it can do. But since a lot of organizations that use SharePoint already have Active Directory, a lot of times they have another location to put this. But look at contacts and see how you can actually put that information in there, because it could be very useful for your team. And then we come down to discussion boards. I mentioned that if you want some back and forth, discussion boards are really nice. Discussion boards actually can be broken down. Don't just think that just one is good for your site. You may have a situation where you need a FAQ. Starting with the discussion board and letting people make comments on it is really nice. Having actual discussions happening on different topics is useful as well. Again, you can actually do some filtering and actually have different topics in your views, but it's generally a lot better to have your discussion boards that are for different topics as different discussion boards, not kind of lumped together. It makes things a lot easier for people to find and a lot less confusing as they go through it. So discussion boards you're probably your biggest collaboration tool inside of SharePoint. So make use of it. Look at it and make sure that your people understand how to use it. And we'll go over it a little bit inside when we go through and create all these lists. Now, beyond the communications, SharePoint is used a lot for tracking activities, what's going on. SharePoint as a project site is very, very valuable for being able to give you out of the box your schedule lists, reports on what's due, what's not. For the SharePoint the developer site that we showed, there's a huge amount of activities that can be put into place and being able to understand what's going on in there. So just take a look and see what we've got there. The calendar is kind of the first off the bat. It's a date-driven list that you can actually go through. You can actually see it in a way that's very familiar with people, but actually be able to pull that data out as structured as well. You can actually tie those calendars in with, say, an Outlook client, so you can understand what's going on with the different pieces and have people able to access that information, not just on your SharePoint website, but wherever else they may be going. So very, very useful there to be able to put it into place. You've got your tasks, which is, I think everybody that's used SharePoint knows this. If not, this is one of the key ones. Being able to drop in and say, here's a task, here's when it started, here's its due date, is it past due, who's it assigned to, what's the stage, all your metadata that you may be using with, say, project and all the rest of it can be done in here. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot of work in project about attaching those, anything that you've got in project or maybe inside of Visual Studio Online, which is Team Foundation Server, back into SharePoint. The online versions of both of those tools actually use SharePoint, so that integration becomes very easy and very powerful once you put it into place. And then there's the issue tracking, which is, if you look at it right, it's pretty much a task list with some additional information associated with it. So you're able to go in there, you're able to pick up those issues, just like we kind of talked about with the ticketing system, maybe for your IT or for your workflows. Be able to track those issues, find out what's going on. It's just got some custom pieces built into the list itself to be able to give things like resolve, what's the status, where you're at in it, all those kind of things. So, very easy to do out of the box. Issue tracker is probably the one that you're going to do the most customization on, because everybody seems to have their own way of doing things with issues. So, but it's a great place to start. It's a great way to kind of drop it out and get going on what you need. So the other thing that we need to look at is, what are the other lists? And these are pretty much lists that you get started on, and you pretty much do it yourself. First on that is obviously custom lists. You can start with a list and just say, hey, just give me basically the title and a date, and I can go from there. And once you do that, you can actually put your list all manner of different ways. There's a lot of different capabilities inside of SharePoint, being able to do things such as lookup columns, being able to do shared information, be actually able to link lists together to actually make small databases inside of SharePoint. Very, very powerful. It's also something that takes a little bit of time to get used to, so we're going to cover that kind of in the customization section a little bit later, but we are going to go through and just kind of show you a real quick piece as I go through the lists themselves in just a minute. And then the other piece that a lot of people use is import spreadsheet. This is something that those who know how to do it and think about it, it's incredibly valuable, especially if you do work with spreadsheets a lot. But then there's a lot of people who just don't think about it. It's not something that pops to mind immediately. But basically what this does is it lets you, if you've got a spreadsheet, if you've got an Excel spreadsheet somewhere, maybe in a CSV that you can pull into Excel, it lets you actually create and populate a list from that data. Why would you do that? Why not just drop that Excel spreadsheet in one of the in a document library and let people work with that? Well, the real benefit for that is that it makes it a lot easier for multiple people to work in that list at the same time. If you're using Excel 2013 on the desktop and you're attached to the SharePoint, there's a lot of things can be done to actually have simultaneous editings and know what's going on with that. And that's an excellent solution. But if you're used to working with people that may have different versions of Excel on the desktop, or you just want to have them be able to do that on your site as well, take a look at just creating a list out of it. If you do need to come back out of it, you can again export that list back into a spreadsheet, be able to pull it all back in and go back and forth with it. But being able to do things that Excel doesn't do, things such as being able to have versions on individual rows, is something that can be quite useful in specific instances. So be able to look at that and think about it, and maybe that would be something that's very useful for you. So that's a rundown on the templates. For just a minute, we're going to jump into the sites themselves and kind of go through these and where you find how to create them. Now that we've gone through the list of lists that you can use, let's actually see them in the context of your site itself. As you can see right here, this is the team site we built earlier by team site. We've got our promoted links here. We've got our announcements here. We've got our document libraries here. So we've got kind of a couple of this here. But let's actually see what we can put onto this site. So we'll go to the site contents. You can see we actually have our forms library for our form templates, our site assets library, which is built into the template itself, the style library, which is another asset library, the documents library, the microfeed, which is your announcements that you can see through there, and the site pages where the actual pages themselves are stored. We don't have any subsites, so we go down through there, and we see that we can add an app. Now this is something that's changed with SharePoint 2013. Before, when you were creating contents, you could create a list or library of subsites. With SharePoint, all the terminology is moving towards apps. So your libraries and your lists are considered apps, as well as other items that you may have picked up or added into your SharePoint implementation. So we're going to go through and we're going to add an app. Now you note we've got the noteworthy across the top, which are three very common: the document library, the custom list, and the tasks. But then down at the below that, you see the full list of the apps you can add. Now, I haven't added any custom application types for this. If your organization has custom apps, they'll show up here as well. Right now, we're just seeing the lists and libraries that are out-of-the-box templates. And you can see we have our all the ones that we looked at through here: the document library, form library, wiki page library, picture library, links, announcements, contacts, calendars, and the rest you can read on down the list. And note that this is paginated. So we can go over and see the next page, which has our asset libraries, our data connection library, which is something I didn't mention, but you can actually use to tie different data into your SharePoint site, your report library that we talked about, and the Access app. This is something that's kind of interesting that SharePoint 2013's really focusing on. Previously, a lot of SharePoint implementations were taking an Access application or an Access database that was maybe used at a department level and then modifying that to fit into SharePoint. With SharePoint 2013, you can actually take those applications and, again, not everything, but a good amount of them can actually be just directly added into SharePoint. SharePoint will basically pull what's out of the Access database and put it into the SQL database, run it that way, and then you can actually continue to do connections with your Access forms on your desktop, or just connect with it in other manners to use that. That being said, let's pop on back and actually do the easiest of the part. Let's make a new document library. So we're going to go in and add this. We get our SharePoint working on it notification. And you notice that we actually have it starts up, and all you really need to do for a document library is do a name. Let's do this as project files, and we can put that in there. Note that we can have spaces in here. That being said, I would recommend that if you're putting together any of the SharePoint lists or libraries, try not to put a space in there because it is web enabled. You'll actually see the wonderful parens and the rest of that, the percentages. We can actually go through and go to our advanced options and a little bit of information. We can actually tell it to use versions or not. For most things, I actually like to do at least 1 or 2 levels of versioning. Let's go ahead and turn on versioning right now. Your SharePoint server administrators may or may not allow you to do this. Normally, you would want this done. And then you can actually create a template. So when someone creates a new file, you can actually give it a template that you can have it start with. So basic page, web part page, or things that if you're doing storing pages in your libraries, you can actually see the Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, and SharePoint Designer web pages. We're just going to stick with a nice Microsoft Word document. So we're going to do that. We're going to create our document library. And now we have it. Note that we actually can, you've got a lot of options on here. You've got your library settings, which we'll go into, and you can see all of this detail. When we go in to modify the list, we're going to talk with that a little bit more. We're not going to jump into it right at the moment, but this is where you do things like set the permissions. This is where you can do custom columns, so you can actually have different information. You can make different views. There are tons of things you can do in here. When we get to customizing the lists and libraries themselves, we'll go in a lot deeper. But you can actually see right here with the web address why I mentioned that you may not want to put a space in there if you think about it, because you would actually have to web enable that when it would come into place. So that's how we actually do a library. You can see that things may work fairly quickly, fairly easily, and we've got our drag and drop files and our regular library view. For doing a list, we'll actually do something a little bit different. We've got our project files down here. You can see it shows up as our site content. We'll add a quick little discussion library or a discussion list. I'm going to go ahead and do the advanced options yet again. And note that all we have here is our and we've got our quick little piece. So we'll go and do a create. Again, now we've got our discussions. We can actually add a new one. We've got recent. We've got our different information here, so we can go in and play, do the work there. And again, we've got all of our customizations up here that we can go through and work with the list itself. Or if we have items, we can actually go over and see the items. Note that our tabs do make it easy for us to understand that context between the two. We can actually go through and do all kinds of different pieces in here, like edit with SharePoint Designer. If you choose to do that, it makes it a little easier. Open with Access, open with Project, export to Excel, connect to Outlook. There's all kinds of things we can do here. Note that this is not enabled because I don't have the right permissions. What that generally means is I don't have something that lines up with what I'm looking at. And then let's do one more creation before we go back and kind of look at what's going on with the lists themselves. And I always like to kind of show this, which is the custom list. We can go in and let's do our pieces here. Again, we'll go in and say and do our custom data list. And the reason why I do that is note that we go in and we've got some basic information that it's already here, but all in all, this just basically has a title that we're looking at. And at this point, that custom list, we can go in and do lots of different things with. So we can customize it to all kinds of different pieces. And then if we get it the right place where we want, we can actually save any of these that we customize as a template and go forward again. So that's what we have here going through the SharePoint lists and how they fit into the sites.